Today's discussion is about understanding childhood trauma and the idea of inner child work. In many Arab households, emotional pain from the past is often pushed aside or ignored, and phrases like "we had it worse" or "don't bring up the past" are common. But those are early experiences, and they can stay with us even into adulthood. Today, I'm honored to have Shireen Musleh who will share insight on this topic. Before we start, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey?
Assalamu alaikum. Very excited to be here to talk to you about this really important topic. Yeah, my name is Shireen Musleh. I'm a Palestinian licensed psychotherapist. I currently work at Khalil Center, which is a psychological and spiritual community wellness center that serves the Muslim community. We are headquartered in Illinois, but we also have offices in the East and West Coast and also in Canada. And we provide culturally sensitive mental health services to the Muslim community where we integrate Islamic principles in our work. Yeah, so I've been providing mental health services to families and individuals for 13 years now, approximately. And I'm currently working mostly with adult women and also couples for premarital and marital therapy.
Thank you for sharing about yourself. To help us understand this topic better, what is childhood trauma and how can it affect someone as they grow up?
Yeah, that's a great place to start because I think just trauma in general is really sometimes not fully understood. I think it's a word we often hear, and it's associated mostly with like major life altering events that are very sudden or like a horrific experience, which in many cases that is the situation, but um it's also really important to note that trauma can come in many different forms. So just to give examples of kind of these, just what's well known as trauma is like, for example, the genocide occurring in Gaza today, as we speak, is obviously creating a lot of childhood trauma. Or sexual abuse during childhood will create a lot of trauma if not addressed and healed. Any witnessing of violence or death can cause trauma. But also there are like other levels of trauma that are more subtle and less obvious, that happen in a repetitive manner in childhood that can also leave a negative psychological and emotional impact on a person, you know? So some examples of that would be like bullying at school, for example. Um, One instance of bullying may not, create trauma, but a repetitive exposure to that treatment can leave negative impacts on a person's like developing psyche, right? Or growing up in a house where there's financial instability or poverty, growing up in a home where there's overcriticism or emotional neglect. That's repetitive exposure of this kind of environment. So, any kind of chronically stressful environment during childhood can alter or like kind of leave a negative effect on a person's psyche. And so in the Arab communities, subhanallah, like there's all these kind of more subtle types of traumas that are left very like just dismissed or invalidated. Even though these are experiences that actually lead to anxiety disorders, depression, possible complex PTSD in adulthood if they're left unresolved, you know? Yeah.
Now that you have explained to us what is childhood trauma, let's talk about what is inner child work and how does it help with childhood trauma.
So, inner child work is a type of therapeutic approach where, the focus is on resolving those kind of childhood traumas. So what it does is, so like the focus of the therapy, so there's multiple types of therapies, but inner child work in particular, the focus is on connecting back to the um child version of oneself, and kind of connecting back to those childhood experiences that led to the emotional pain that you know um that was never addressed or processed. And then there's a kind of identifying the unmet needs that led to unhealthy coping mechanisms in adulthood. And I'll give examples. But like, just to kind of give a general explanation, it's this inner child work is a type of therapy that provides a space to process that emotional pain, and it ultimately guides the person to learn how to meet those needs in a healthy way in adulthood, right? But before you can kind of meet any needs, you have to have like build the awareness of like where the issues stem from.
Sometimes people don't realize their childhood still affect them today. What are some ways trauma from childhood can show up in someone's life as an adult?
Yeah. So again, like I think like the big capital T trauma, like oftentimes is like acknowledged, it's like obvious. Oh, this person had like a significant loss in their childhood, or they experienced war or something. So it might be more obvious for that person, kind of the impact of that trauma on them. But there are actually a lot of patterns of coping in adults that signal unresolved trauma, right? And they're very subtle. It's hard to know that this is actually from childhood. So, for example, I'll give some examples of some patterns. We'll see a lot of people in our community, like, for example, that have people pleasing tendencies, so people pleasing tendencies. So, when a person has people pleasing patterns, there's a core belief that they developed in childhood, most likely, where this is a subconscious belief that they have. So, subconscious meaning they're not aware that they have this belief, but it is a belief that drives their behavior. And this belief is, if I make other people happy, I'll be safe and I'll feel love. I'll be loved. So maybe this child had to kind of always like mitigate between parents that are fighting, or maybe the parent, for example, was always upset unless the child like did things to make the parent happy. So they learn that the way to be safe and loved is to please others, and then they carry that pattern with them into adulthood. And so um these individuals in adulthood, like, they don't know how to say no. They always just do what everybody asks them to do. They don't really know how to be assertive or set healthy boundaries in relationships. So another example of a pattern that signals unresolved trauma is perfectionism. There's this core belief that drives this perfectionism, which is, if I do everything perfectly, no one will criticize me or reject me. This likely comes from shame that came from being overly criticized when you were a child, or compared to other children. This is very common in Arab communities, right? We say, look at this cousin of yours, or this person that is, and there's this comparison, making the child feel shame and that they need to be perfect if they are going to be loved or accepted. So this obviously stays with them into adulthood, and they become individuals who overwork themselves. They have a strong fear of failure. They tie their worth to achievement and productivity. And yet, despite all that effort, they never feel good enough. So, someone who has perfectionism, no matter how hard they work, they never feel like they're good enough, or that they're doing good enough work, right? And so that's not healthy. um Another kind of, I don't know how many examples, I have tons of examples, but maybe I'll give a few more, if that's
Yep,
okay.
feel free.
Yeah, like avoidance or numbing is a very common pattern in adults that is actually rooted in childhood trauma, because the belief that drives that is, if I don't feel it, I won't feel like be hurt by it, or I won't feel overwhelmed. So there's this pattern of emotionally neglecting, like um, there's emotional neglect and emotional overwhelm, right? And so these individuals probably grew up in an environment where they were told, actually, stop crying, stop being angry. Like they were told, like, to stop feeling what they're feeling, and so this actually leads to a lot of issues growing up. Um, so yeah, I mean, these are just a few examples, but there's many, many other patterns that you see in adulthood that, like, you can tell is a signal that there's unresolved childhood trauma there.
Thank you for sharing. That's a lot of good information. Sometimes when people start thinking about their past, they feel guilty or embarrassed. Why do you think that happens, especially in our culture?
I think it goes back to the messaging that was received in childhood about, like, for example, um, this idea of, like, to not feel what you're feeling, right? Like the suppressing of emotions. So then when there's memories or things that come up for a person, they feel bad about themselves that this is coming up for them. There's a messaging that maybe, you know, feelings are a sign of weakness, for example. There's this cultural messaging of that. So some of the guilt comes from being not being able to suppress the feelings or emotions. So there's maybe leading to thoughts of what's wrong with me, or um, so it's all internalized false beliefs that they develop in childhood that lead to low self-esteem, and it affects how they decide to process or, like, work through the emotions. You know.
In your opinion, for those who want to heal but don't know where to start, what is the first small step they can take to begin working on their inner healing?
Yeah, I think that the first, I would say the most important step into helping kind of working on this inner healing would be to first give yourself permission to acknowledge that you may be struggling emotionally. And I think, kind of as we said before, if just there's this chronic pattern in our communities to suppress emotion, uh, because parents and, in previous generations, like, they themselves went through trauma, they themselves have unresolved trauma, and so we call that generational trauma, where they kind of pass on the unhealthy coping to their children, right? And so there's this pattern of suppressing what we're feeling or experiencing all the time. And so then, even we, as we get older, we develop an internal critic where we're judging ourselves even for what we're feeling, right? So I think when you ask that, like, what's the first step? Like, the most basic step moving forward to healing is giving yourself permission to acknowledge what you're feeling, or what that you may be struggling, even if you don't really know how to navigate it or what to do about it, but at least acknowledge it, and that it's okay that you're struggling. And so I know that seeking therapy is probably a big step for some people, not so much a little step, but I promise that making that first appointment is actually probably the hardest part, and then going to therapy, you start to realize that you finally have the space to take accountability for your own mental health, and also the idea is, like, a lot of times when we talk about childhood trauma, like, there's a fear that, oh, I'm gonna have to, like, acknowledge that my parents may have hurt me or didn't protect me, or point fingers or blame or something. But although that you may need to process some anger or resentment maybe throughout the process, but the point of healing is actually to give you a better quality of life, and so it kind of, when you heal, it leads to healthier thinking and healthier emotional regulation, and it leads to healthier relationships, you know? So just that, yeah, like just acknowledging that you may be struggling and then considering going to therapy and giving yourself that opportunity to heal.
Thank you for being here with us today, and I'm really glad that I had the chance to talk to you. Before we end, is there any final quote or message you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah, sure. You know, there's no better words than the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah says, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Allah does not burden a soul beyond that it can bear. You know, and this means that every hardship we face, you know, we do have the capacity to endure it and overcome it, you know. And so it's just a reminder that no matter what type of childhood trauma or hardship we experience, it is part of our journey that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala destined for us. And it can lead to personal growth and resilience and reward, you know, if we choose to perceive it that way. So I'm very happy that I was able to, have the opportunity to talk to you about this important topic. So thank you so much.